So just an introduction for myself. My name is Meer Bhavsar. I'm a senior at Madison High School in Madison, New Jersey. I'm very interested in politics and I plan to major in government at Cornell this fall. My hobbies include art,
You've been
listening to music.
accepted. You've been
Yeah,
accepted. You're all good. Congratulations. That's a big
thank
deal.
you.
Good
Thank you.
job.
So my hobbies include like art, listening to music, and just like going out with my friends. Like Matthew said, I typically align with like the more progressive side on most issues, but I think working across the aisle with compromise is very important to progression. So I would describe myself as politically active because I've done like a lot of advocacy work. So I've met with like representatives from the New Jersey Department of Education to discuss equity in rural slash underrepresented areas of New Jersey. And so like a lot of the advocacy work I've done in politics has been more like education policy focused just because that's something I'm interested in.
That's all appropriate.
Mhm.
Um, and look, I think we'll get along. Are you done? Am I stepping in now? Or are you
Yeah,
still
yeah,
going?
yeah.
So I
I'm
think we'll
good.
get along. Many of my best friends are Democrats, and several of them are progressives. We have interesting debate. They may be wrong, but I love them. So we come together. My daughter leans pretty hard left, and we have great conversations. Um, I and I don't mean to sound like a stodgy adult. When I was your age, I was a Democrat as well, and I evolved over time. And I have friends that were Republicans that are now Democrats, so it happens. But happy to have a freewheeling conversation, and look, I think part of the opening there was to meet in the middle. Not necessarily. You you don't want to water down everybody's positions till they mean nothing. Sometimes meeting in the middle is the right thing. Uh, Other times, one or the other side can be convinced of the other's argument, and that is okay too. Uh, we shouldn't be wedded to our parties. One of the greatest lessons I've learned in my political career is that it's more important to seek the truth than to perpetuate your previously held beliefs, and that is very unshackling realization to come to. Once you let go of that, it becomes life becomes more challenging in some ways, but also much more grounding. So, looking forward to our freewheeling conversation.
Mhm. All right. So we can start with the first question, which is under the basic policy questions section. So how can New Jersey balance the need for fiscal responsibility with the demands for increased investment in essential services and infrastructure?
And that is something I've been very outspoken on. We need to get responsible. So, both uh, Republicans and Democrats who aren't directly at the table trying to bring home the bacon can agree that New Jersey's budget is full of way too much ridiculous pork, which prioritizes cricket fields over the needy. Uh, that's outrageous. And in any given budget year, there's, you and I could probably sit down and agree. There's $1 billion worth of crap in the budget. Excuse my choice of language, but I'm going to be direct with you guys. Uh, there's $1 billion worth of stuff that could be redirected. Uh, Unfortunately, because we have not prioritized, because we have not taken advantage of the golden opportunity over the last 6, 7 years, particularly the last 4 or 5 years, our budget has a $5 billion structural deficit. So that's a real problem. And that will really put in jeopardy our ability to fund things that you and I would both agree are high priority things to fund. So it's a problem. But the bottom line answer to your question is we need to get responsible, hold our elected officials responsible, and insist that they create an actually balanced, not just a phony balanced budget. And I bet that you and I, were you to come and work in my office, we'd probably end up in the same place on where this budget ought to be this year. But it's Democrat legislative leadership, and some of them, my friends, can't get there. And that's a shame. And nor can the governor, actually. His budget as proposed has $3.5 billion structural deficit, really over four, but let's be nice. and that's a problem. But that's how to
Yeah,
do it. Uh, is elect more responsible people who believe in a really genuinely balanced budget and believe in uh, prioritizing spending rather than putting money in certain people's pockets.
yeah, I agree. I think we need to identify like essential services and infrastructure projects that have the most impact on things like public welfare, specifically for like low income residents, to tackle sort of like the wealth disparity that we have in New Jersey. And so I think that it's important to make sure that funds are actually going somewhere and they're not just floating around. And so things like having a rainy day fund to make sure that even like the most minor expenses are covered for is important, because if we just have some money like lying around, it's not really going anywhere, there's no really like big use to it.
Agreed. Uh, uh, Although uh, you need to have some buffer in case of economic downturn. So having some level of surplus is reasonable. Again, here you and I are going to completely agree. The Republican plan of the last several years would put more of our money to work. We ended up last year with an $8 billion surplus. Look, I'm all for a responsible surplus. You need one, but 8 billion was way more than if you had a structurally balanced budget, then you would need. The reason why I think the governor did that was so he wouldn't have to make any real major decisions in his last couple of years in office. So we could burn through the surplus and just not make those decisions. Republicans would have had a surplus of 4 to 5 billion and put the rest of the money to work rather than have it sitting around being eaten away by inflation. So I think, again, another area where I think you and I would see eye to eye on.
Yeah, I like generally agree with that. I think more government spending is important. And so if the Republican Party is doing that, that would obviously accommodate like what I believe. And I think that spending should go towards things like funding programs like public welfare. Um, and I think that more public-private partnerships are also really important. Like the whole situation that kind of happened with Netflix, with like the government kind of having partnership there. I think that's important because it's like we don't really need to treat public and private like they're two separate realms. They can be like together, and it doesn't really need to be as isolated as it currently is.
Yeah, there's plenty of room for public-private partnerships. Interestingly, but look, but I would err on the side of uh, letting the private sector flourish and get government out of its way for the most part. So, like the Netflix deal, I'm pretty intimately familiar with it. That really was it. Ultimately, is not a public-private partnership because government doesn't really have an investment there, and they're not delivering public service. But it's actually the other way around. It's government getting the hell out of the way. It's high tax rates. My friends on the other side of the aisle like to argue frequently that taxes don't really affect business decisions, but the Murphy administration itself advocated for the highest tax breaks, film tax credits in the country, and it worked. It brought Netflix in, and we got out of the way with some of the regulatory stuff too. So there, it was government hearing from industry and getting the hell out of the way, and it worked. I think Netflix is going to be a really great addition to the region, and it will help everyone, including some of the less well-off that you're talking about. This whole region is going to flourish. Netflix is right in my backyard. I don't know if you know where my district is, but a big portion of the Netflix project, well, a portion of the Netflix project is in my district, but it's bordering. Fort Mom, a big chunk of it is in my district. So this whole region is gonna thrive, or at least be helped by that project, and that is a real case study in the impact that high taxes can have, and the impact lowering taxes can have, and the impact that government can have in bringing projects here and helping them happen by working with the private sector to try to get out of the way. So it's a good, interesting project that you brought up. But look, I like public-private partnerships as well, where there's actual government really works with private sector. That can be good too. It's just got to be smart, and I look at those projects as they come.
Makes sense. Okay. So moving on to the next question, what are some of the key challenges facing New Jersey's budgetary process and how they might be addressed?
This gets kind of where I touched on before, where we have a structural deficit. So tying everything we spoke about together, right? You're better off with a $4 billion surplus and a structurally balanced budget than you are with an $8 billion surplus and a budget that has a structural deficit. In our case, we really are at about $5 billion structural deficit. We could have, over the past few years, and it's really a tragically missed opportunity for everyone in New Jersey, but particularly for young folks like you guys who are going to have to pay the bills for our lack of addressing these issues when we really had a chance to remake our budget. We had billions of dollars in federal money. We borrowed $4 billion unnecessarily. Had we put all of that to work, and had we really tackled our structural budget problems, we could have made huge headway. For instance, our school funding formula. We could have tweaked our school funding formula, which was put in place back in 2008 and was unrealistic. I was running in those years, and I said the school funding formula was unattainable. It was pie in the sky. And it was too much. We were going to be dumping too much money into education. And I'm all for funding education, but we have a finite amount of money. You don't just throw money by the billions at something when you have other priorities that you actually have to fund as well. So we could have reworked our school funding formula. Rather than, Governor Murphy has put an additional $3.5 billion into school funding. Rather than putting an additional 3.5 in, we could have been additional 2.5, avoided the cuts that we've seen to many of these districts, you've probably seen in the news, and given a lot more money to the districts that had been underfunded, and they would have been perfectly happy, just not as much money, and knocked $1 billion off our structural deficit, and been responsible about all these things. Instead, we did none of that. And now the school funding formula has been fully funded. We phased it in completely, which we should not have done. And school districts are the ones that are getting cut, have huge challenges. It's a mess. I mean, 200 districts have some serious challenges when we're spending the most of any state in the nation. And we've increased spending dramatically over the past few years, and we still have districts that are struggling. That is unconscionable. Had we done all of these things holistically, we'd be in a much better position. We still would have a structural deficit, but we could have done other things. Another round of reasonable pension and benefits reform probably could knock another $1 billion off our structural deficit. We would have been in much, much better shape now. And we're not. But those are the things we could do, is holistically look at our budget, really, really take advantage of the opportunities that we have when they come up, not kick the can down the road or ignore them. And we'd be in much better shape now. And if we do these practices now going forward, we can get into a much better position much quicker than if we continue to dig this hole. This year, our revenues are reasonable. They didn't fall off a cliff. These are pretty good times. And we're already burning through 25% of that outrageously large surplus that I talked about. That is really scary. And that's a shame. It doesn't have to be that way. But those are the things we can do to fix the budget. And look, Republicans have been very active. We put out alternatives to the governor's budget, to the Democrat legislators' budget every year. I mean, they're very detailed plans. And had we followed those plans, we'd be much, much better off today. We did not. And we are really, it's a house of cards budget. As I said the other day, it's a house of cards built on a fault line. It's a problem. It's scary. And it's your generation that's really going to pay for it.
Yeah, like I think that there's been a general like failure to pass reforms in like New Jersey's budgetary process, like the 2022 stress testing bill and the whole like consensus forecasting process idea that they had in 2018.
No, correct. And multi-year budgeting, there absolutely should be a projection out at least 3 years. Beyond that, it's hard to predict because you really can't know what the economy is going to do. We do none of that. And it's purposeful. They don't want to talk about it. They'd rather not deal with the politics of all of that. The stress test as well. If we were to do a stress test, it would be public, and the ratings agencies would probably downgrade our bond rating. It's that bad. And so we're absolutely on the same wave.
Great. So moving on to the next question, how can New Jersey ensure that budget decisions align with its broader goals and values as a state?
So that's a matter of having public discussion, right? That's a matter uh, of talking about all these things like we're doing right now, and and again, being honest with the public, and holding elected officials, particularly legislators, accountable. I think that's and we kind of are dovetailing that question with what we've already talked about. But I think that's the simple answer: is having these longer range discussions, having them in public, and look, and encouraging the public to pay more attention. You're an example. Everyone who's ever going to see this, especially young people, you are the vast minority of people your age. They just don't pay attention, and they don't get involved. And when I hear you said you've been very active, probably campaigns of people that are running against people that I'm backing, I don't care. Get involved, get out there, and look, and also have discussions with people like me on the other side. Be willing to switch sides if it makes sense. Those things are too radical today. They shouldn't be. But you encouraging your peers to get more involved. And look, me too. I've been encouraging people to get involved since I was your age. Yeah, I sound like an old guy now. But it's really important for us to have more people get more involved and genuinely hold people accountable. And that starts with your own party. When they're not coming through it, I fight my own party on a regular basis. I oppose my own party on a regular basis. When something's right, it's right, and you go with it. And I defend people in the other party on a regular basis. So we need more of that. If we do all that, that's really the answer to that question.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think what you were kind of saying is like with the future generations, like we need to be more in tune with them. And like I think that a lot of like the way New Jersey budgeting is set up is it's kind of outdated. Like I know specifically for education, like the NJ student learning standards are renewed every 5 years, and oftentimes it's not really like in tune with what's happening at the present. So there's always this push for the future, but it's not necessarily always catching up to itself when there are like issues that are currently happening, and so it becomes outdated over time. So I think that is like an issue with the way it's set up because like yes, there's like a push for broader goals to be solved, but there are also issues currently happening that because of the way that system is set, I mean specifically for education, that leads to these like current issues not being solved.
You're exactly right. And your focus on education is valuable for education. It's also valuable for other areas in the budget where we're short-sighted. Again, I mentioned the school funding formula. It was put together in 2007 and passed in early 2008. Don't hold me to that. I've got to look that up, but it was right around that. So it's old. It was outdated and unachievable within a couple of years. We knew that it was never going to be able to be funded to the levels that the folks that put it together wanted to be. The only reason why it's fully funded now is because we were flush with cash from the federal government from the pandemic that would never have happened, and it's unsustainable. Now it's fully funded. The governor stood up in his State of the State speech or his budget speech, I can't remember which one, maybe both, and said, we're fully funding the formula as something to be proud of. I'm like, no, you should be ashamed of yourself that you didn't rework the formula and stop this outrageous level of spending that is going to crowd out so many other things and or cause massive increases in taxes. It really is a shame. And it is short-sighted. But you're right. There's no question that we need to be more dynamic in our thinking across the board. And look, I hammered the legislature and the governor for the past more than 4 years about this. We got lip service about redoing the school funding formula. I do a lot of my own policy work, and we're really in depth. We produce really good policy. I'm proud of. I'm fairly good at it. But the school funding formula is so complicated. You can't do it without the cooperation of the Department of Education. You just can't do it. So I put together valuable panels of people and state legislators, the other side of the aisle. And everybody said, oh, we're going to do this. And I hounded everyone, and nothing. It really is distressing to me. But you're absolutely right. We need to do more of that. No question.
Totally agree. So moving on to the next question, should New Jersey continue borrowing to cover budget shortfalls, or should the state focus on implementing spending cuts and revenue raising measures to achieve fiscal sustainability?
Well, there's a question of how much we're borrowing to, although, by not putting the extra money we had over this past few years that is now gone towards things like real debt defeasance, more money into the pension system, which we're going to have to make up our pension deficit. You could argue that that is borrowing. So your point is fair. But I would argue absolutely not. One-shot revenue is no way to balance a budget. So it's really looking. Main thing we need to do is get our spending under control, and that is not happening. Our taxes are the highest in the nation right now in almost every category. You can't do that forever. Being an outlier, and I don't care whether on the left or the right. I have some friends of mine on the left who suggest that taxes don't matter, while at the same time advocating tax cuts to bring in entities like Netflix. Taxes do matter. People do make choices about where their domicile is going to be. And I hear when I make the argument that high taxes chase people out of the state, it isn't everyday people that are generally chased out of the state with high taxes. It's the real big whales, the big money people that do make these decisions based on taxes. You have people who are there's people making $1 billion a year that pay $100 million in taxes to New Jersey every year. We're fools if we think that they don't think, I've already got a couple of houses in Florida. I already spend, 3-4 months out of the year out of the state. All I have to do is spend another few weeks out of the state, and I can eliminate that $100 million in taxes. That absolutely does impact. So we need to focus on getting our spending under control and reorienting our priorities of spending. That's where we really need to focus before we ask the taxpayers for one dime. But certainly, we should be borrowing money to balance our budget. But we're not really directly doing that. But our budget practices are irresponsible, as I think I've outlined already. No matter whether it's direct borrowing or kicking the can down the road and continuing a structural deficit like we are.
Yeah, to add on to the point that we borrow a lot, I think it's very temporary. It's a very temporary solution to address immediate budget shortfalls, and it's a way to make to address these shortfalls without making immediate cuts to essential services that we have in New Jersey. But I think that relying too much on borrowing can obviously increase the state's debt burden and lead to higher interest payments in the future, and then that can obviously cause further financial challenges. But I do agree that there are so many tax loopholes that New Jerseyans have, the situation you outlined with the guy or this man figuratively going to Florida to avoid his $100 million tax rate or tax payment. So I think closing those tax loopholes and making sure that that level of corruption and greed is kind of minimized to make sure that.
Well, to be fair, I'm not suggesting he's corrupt. He's trying to protect his money, and there's not much New Jersey could do about that other than have competitive tax rates. Florida has no income tax, so if you change your domicile and New Jersey doesn't have any jurisdiction over that, you can declare your residency in Florida. You're essentially moving to Florida. Now that doesn't mean he doesn't still have a house here. I've got Some of my friends on the other side of the aisle like to say, well, you know, we're not looking at empty mansions when we drive down Navesink River Road in Middletown, which is a very wealthy street, or in Rumson. No, they're not empty. But if you go to each one, knock on the door, and ask them to show you their driver's license, the owners, many of them are Florida driver's licenses. That's perfectly legit. They're allowed to own houses here and own houses in Florida. And if they legitimately are spending 6 months in a day outside of the state, they have every right to declare that their domicile and pay taxes there. And if those taxes go to zero, they have that right. And that, by New Jersey increasing taxes all the time rather than dealing with our structural deficit or spending problems, we push these people into making those decisions. We make it worthwhile for them to make those decisions.
Well, I think, like, personally, like, a philosophy of mine is that, like, billionaires shouldn't exist just because there are people out there living paycheck to paycheck. So, like, when there are people who have, billions of dollars, and there are people who are living paycheck to paycheck, like, it's kind of like why, one, like, I think the government should be responsible for collecting that money from the billionaires and making sure it's distributed equally. But then it's also a moral statement, like, why are these people with such high wealth? Why don't they want to give back, and why do they want to hoard their wealth so much? So I think in that sense, like, it's like, I think in that sense they are corrupt. But again, like, they obviously do have the right to, if they want to go to Florida to claim their residency there and, like, avoid the tax break, they obviously have that right because it's a state level law. But that's why, like, my personal belief is that that should be a federally mandated thing, like, because obviously you can get loopholes like that way.
Well, look, here's the thing. If we start confiscating billionaires' money, the billionaires will leave the country. So that's something to worry about. You can't do these things in a vacuum. It's like New Jersey with its high tax rates. These people can leave. If this country had confiscatory tax rates, other countries would take advantage of that and lure people there. So you gotta act within, know that your actions can have other reactions. But I would argue that it's unfair to call them corrupt. Most people with a lot of money give a lot of money back, and by having some incentive that people can have security and have a good time, you incentivize them to create more wealth, and usually they're creating jobs. I mean, look at Elon Musk, for instance. I don't know how many jobs he's created, but it's an awful lot of jobs. He's created an awful lot of wealthy people who were, not wealthy before. You look at, entry-level programmers at Google and Microsoft and Facebook who are, very wealthy now because these people grew these businesses and there was the incentive to do so. So I would disagree that government ought to come in and confiscate, money above any level. I think you can have a reasonable tax structure that is progressive. I'm okay with that. But to have, to say we're going to confiscate all money above $1 billion, you will see economic growth in this country dramatically reduced. You'll see charity from these high income earners dramatically reduced. So you got to be careful about the unintended consequences. I get where you're coming from. I think we have to be broader thinking about it.
I kind of disagree with that. I don't necessarily think of it as confiscating, but more that they're paying their fair share. Because I mean, $1 billion is a lot of money. Like, that's how much the state government, like some like state governments, like, they have a few $1 billion. Like, one person shouldn't own that much money when a whole entire state collectively has tax revenue in that quantity. So in
So
my opinion,
you would take the tax rate to 100% for someone who makes $1 billion or more a year. Above $1 billion, you'd say the tax rate should be 100%.
like you're saying, like, would I say that?
Yeah, exactly. How would you take that? How would you have government take that? I'm genuinely interested in the give and take. I get where you're coming from, but how would you effectuate that? And how would you stop then people making that type of money from changing their place of residence to the Cayman Islands, which might say, well, we're only going to take 50% of your billion over $1 billion. How do you do that in practice?
Well, I mean, a lot of, like, I feel like a lot of billionaires own these like multinational corporations. So the jobs are still going to be in place. And obviously America has such like a good, like comparatively to like these third world countries where they could possibly reside, we have a really good economy. So there's a lot of opportunity there for the billionaires to like capitalize on. So I feel like them moving out of the country could be kind of like it could be harmful to their own business.
Maybe if you go to 100% tax rate above $1 billion, they're going to figure out a way, and other countries will step into that void and create tax structures that treat them better than we do, better enough to have them change their domicile. People do make decisions based on that, but we could talk more about this. It's an interesting line, but I don't see that as workable. Whether you believe billionaires should exist or not, I think if our country were to try to eliminate them, it wouldn't work in our favor.
Okay. Moving on to the next question.
Sure.
Should New Jersey prioritize increasing taxes on businesses to bolster state revenue and address budget deficits, or does this approach risk driving away businesses and hindering economic growth? So we touched on this, but like just like a more defined like answer.
We did, and really quickly, it's a pertinent answer, pertinent question, because we have our CBT, our corporate business tax. You see our surrounding states run by Democrats working on having lower corporate business taxes. We're going in the other direction. We have the highest, and we want to make it higher. And you see businesses avoiding that tax here by it's a little complicated because it's not a direct tax, but they outsource or they buy things outside of the state. So this gets right back to our actions having reactions. So I think that where we agree, focusing on our costs first and where we're spending our money is the better way to go. I don't think we have much room to increase our business taxes because we're already the highest in the nation, and we're already seeing the negative impacts of them.
Yeah, I definitely I know what you're talking about with like I think our corporate business tax is like 11.5% and it's the highest in the nation.
Well,
There was like a lot of like discrepancy between like Murphy originally saying that he would stop that tax and then not following through with that. And like I think
he did
generally
ultimately. He did this past year, ultimately, or for a year, he did, but he's right back to raising it up again. He's calling it something else. He's calling it corporate transit fee, I think. And this is another area of irresponsible budgeting. And this is a big $1 billion hole, getting back to one of the other things we talked about in our structural deficit. So they propose to implement the corporate transit fee, which is really the corporate business tax by another name, and it'll generate $1.2 billion. And they say that is the money they're going to use the following year to plug $1 billion hole at transit. But they're getting the money this year and they're using it in our general fund. So if it's going to go to transit next year, that's a whole extra $1 billion hole in our general fund. It's insanity. But yes, the governor sang the praises of letting what was it supposed to be a temporary increase in our corporate business tax expire, and then right away he re-implemented it with another name. It's not good policy, and it's not honest.
I agree. It's not honest because it's kind of just playing with. It's like playing politics with the situation, basically.
Yes, that is true. That is true.
All right. Moving on to the next question. Is it fair to rely heavily on taxpayers to fund essential services and programs within the state budget, or should New Jersey explore alternative revenue streams to alleviate the burden on individuals and households?
Well, give me some ideas of alternative revenue streams because, money's fungible, right? So give me a couple of examples of alternative revenue streams that you're thinking about.
So like legalized cannabis sales and taxing and implementing taxes or fees on activities that like harm the environment for like such like for things like carbon emissions, plastic waste, recycling. Also like luxury taxes could all be forms of alternative revenue streams?
Well, yeah, I mean, those aren't alternatives. Those are just different taxes, right? So taxing cannabis means that people buying cannabis pay more. And we have some of the highest cannabis taxes in the country, which creates the illicit market, perpetuates the illicit market. So again, there's a limit to our taxes. And once you increase them to a certain point, and I argued for very low cannabis taxes so that we could destroy the illicit market, the legal market. Nobody listened to me, so we still have one, and we have really expensive cannabis in the state, and that impacts certainly the medical aspect. Some of the folks that can at least pay those things. So I think we've already mined that as much as we could. Luxury tax, that's again more taxes on the wealthy. It depends on how you structure it. You're going to tax luxury goods at a higher rate. Well, you're wealthy, you're going to buy the stuff in states with lower luxury taxes. So it all comes out of people's pockets. And what you really need to do, again, getting back to the very beginning of our conversation, is have a responsible, balanced budget that is a reasonable level of spending per capita, that inflicts taxes fairly, and taxes that people will accept and not work as hard as they can to avoid them. That's what you need, because there just simply aren't alternatives that don't have consequences. They all do.
Yeah, and I definitely think like the whole like illegal like sale with like or like illegal market with like cannabis definitely is an issue because I mean if cannabis is legalized in New Jersey then like we should be incentivizing that more than we should be upholding the whole illegal market. So I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, you look, we should have learned. I went to Colorado to study what they did there when we were having the debate over legalization. I ultimately voted against legalization, mostly because of the tax structure that was put in place, because I felt that our first job should be to stop persecuting people for what is generally reasonable behavior, number one. But really, number two, a close second, is to eliminate the illicit market. I mean, the money that flows to these gangs that causes violence and a host of other ills in our society, really starving that market and the people running it of revenue should have been one of our top priorities. I was not listened to, and we knew, because Colorado and several other states started with really high taxes, and they found out that they were not eliminating the illicit market, because your average consumer, right, would rather buy legal cannabis and know it's regulated, know what's in it, it's not laced with anything. They would, if it's a certain level above street price for the legal stuff. And I think that threshold, don't hold me to this, but I think, because it was a few years ago now that I was working on this, was you could charge about 25% more than street value of illegal cannabis, and you would really, a lot of people would come over. You'd win them over. Above that, and you're opening the door to a perpetuation of the legal market. We saw other states have that very experience, and instead, New Jersey has taxed way more than that, and we perpetuate the illegal market, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think also the argument with like legalizing cannabis is that it could provide a lot more job opportunities. And so along with like potentially, obviously like getting rid of that like gang culture and like that whole like thing, like it could create more jobs. And if people are gonna do it anyway, in my opinion, like we should be accommodative to that. So like for instance, like throughout history, like we had a higher like drinking age limit and like that never works. Like so in my opinion, like making things more accessible when people are gonna do things anyway, like it doesn't make sense to make things illegal.
Yeah, frequently that's true, right? I mean, look, there's some things that, like, I wouldn't legalize heroin because it is just so dramatically destructive and addictive. We know this. You've seen other countries experiment with legalization of drugs at various levels, and at some levels, it seems to work. Levels more broad than we are currently legalizing here in this country. You've seen some throw the doors open, and they've had some negative consequences that they've had to walk back. But it's really an interesting debate, and it kind of brings progressives and more libertarian conservatives together. Some of those debates, and they're fascinating. We have to be careful, but it's certainly marijuana, cannabis. It's very hard to justify keeping that illegal or making it illegal again. Sure, are there some issues? There are, but people use it anyway. Let's not kid ourselves. The government can come in and eliminate the use of marijuana. It's never worked, and it never will. So, and there's a hypocrisy thing, right? Someone standing there with their gin and tonic, bemoaning that we shouldn't legalize marijuana. You're a friggin' hypocrite, stop. Alcohol has killed many, many more people than marijuana ever has. So stop with the hypocrisy, and let's have a real honest conversation. It looks like we are. I mean, the Biden administration's reclassifying cannabis from a Schedule I drug, which is ridiculous, is a smart move for a whole host of reasons. So we're generally moving in the right direction there. But it's been interesting because when I voted for legalization of medical, I was right around the time when I was changing offices. And I was going around talking to a lot of fairly conservative Republicans who were really against legalization of any type of marijuana. And at that point, it was a debate over medical. And I was completely convinced that was the right thing to do. And I wasn't going to pander to these folks. If they were against that, they shouldn't back me for the position. And I did. I won the position. But I had a number of people, nicely, it wasn't, militant, saying, oh, it's a terrible thing. Sorry about that. Can you still see me or hear me?
Yeah.
I've had several of those people years later now. One in particular, she's absolutely lovely, wonderful human being, pulled me off to the side and say, thank God you voted for medical. She's older. She's like, it's the only thing that's helped my pain and did give me a batch of other side effects. She's like, thank you for doing the right thing, despite me being wrong about the issue. It's kind of cool. It's interesting.
So is New Jersey's budget allocation adequately addressing the needs of underserved communities and marginalized populations, or does it perpetuate existing disparities in access to resources and opportunities?
I think it does a pretty good job. I mean, it doesn't eliminate folks who were in need, but we really a very progressive tax rate. We have, vast swaths of our budget really are a wealth transfer, a legitimate one in many areas. You do have to take care of the people that can't take care of themselves. So I think we do a pretty good job. I argue that some of our tax rates are too high. I think we're probably doing too much of that transfer because I think we do see some of these very rich people leaving, and that transfers their burden down to the middle class and down to folks that are striving to get in the middle class, because all taxes have to go up when those people leave. So I think we do okay. I think we really do. And when we talk next, we could talk about the wisdom of concentrating just real quick, wealth taxes on the wealthy and higher income taxes are the most volatile taxes. So, you see the market move and you can see great gyrations in our revenue. And that isn't good for the poor and the needy, because if you have major gyrations, all of a sudden you can have mid-year cuts to valuable service that these folks have come to depend on. So again, it gets back to our conversation earlier about worrying about consequences. So I think we do a pretty good job in that area. I don't think that one could argue that New Jersey is being abusive to people that need. We feed almost everyone. There's no excuse for anyone to not to be going hungry in New Jersey. Everybody should be able to get a pretty reasonable education. And again, there's a lot of tweaks here. There's a lot of areas we could do somewhat better, but we do a pretty good job, I think, overall.
I agree. I will just add the word comparatively. I think comparatively to the rest of the nation, we do a really good job, but there obviously are still issues. Like I think specifically what comes to mind is like urban areas like Jersey City, Newark. I think that there's obviously disparities there between an area where I'm in, like Madison, New Jersey, where generally everybody is pretty wealthy. Like in my experience at high school, people have been able to afford like private tutors, SAT classes, things like that. Versus when you compare students to, urban areas like Newark and Jersey City, they they are more likely to come from low income backgrounds and they won't have the same opportunities that people in my area do. So I think obviously there's always going to be that disparity. It's more just how do we accommodate to that rather than,
Well, I mean, look,
pretending it doesn't exist.
we put a ton of money into, and as talk about education, so there's your focus, and it does tie into the difference between wealthy and folks who are less wealthy or even poor. We dump a huge amount of money into Asbury Park, into Newark. I mean, it's dramatic how much money. If you look per student, it's like $30,000 in Asbury Park, and we put as a state very little money into wealthy school districts. So I think even there we're doing as much as we can, and our tax rates are really really high. They're too high in many areas. We're driving some of these wealthy people out. So I don't think you could do too much more in those areas. But what a pleasure chatting with you. We need more engaged, smart people like you